My name is Nick Ryan, and I believe in the paranormal. I've spent most of my life researching the unknown, collecting extraordinary stories, and searching for explanations to some of the most bizarre phenomena imaginable. Now, I'd like to take you on a journey that leads down a darker and less traveled path into the unexplained, the supernatural, and the downright terrifying, as we take a look at the strangest reports from around the world, and quite possibly your very own hometown. So whether you're at home, at work, or on the road, please join me as we begin this episode of the Paranormal Mysteries Podcast. Yes, welcome to the show once again, everybody. I am your host, Nick Ryan. For as long as I can remember, I have loved Halloween. As I've mentioned before, I grew up in Michigan, and there's something very special about this region of the country, especially in the fall. Now, don't get me wrong, I've lived in many other states and in other countries, and they all have their own beauty and charm. But for me, there is something about the North Woods that holds a certain energy and vibe when autumn comes to call. Perhaps it's the changing colors of the leaves, the smell of apples being churned into cider in the nearby mills, or even the lingering chill in the air that comes to rest upon the local pumpkin patches and corn mazes. It's an experience that I hope many of you can relate to, because for me, it's on my short list of my most favorite things in this strange and beautiful world. For many, Halloween is a celebration of the loved ones that have been lost. It is a time to embrace our fear of the unknown, and it's a reminder of the holidays that are soon to follow. It's a time of the year that holds a great deal of significance in many cultures for a multitude of reasons. So rather than me sitting here spouting off facts about the history of Halloween, I urge you to take the time and research it for yourself. I think you just might be pleasantly surprised at what you learn about this amazing holiday. Instead, I'd like to take some time tonight to share a few stories with you. Some will be from our very own listeners, and others will be from a variety of other sources. A handful of special stories that deserve to be read tonight on Halloween. So sit back and relax as we get into the spirit of the season, and we'll begin tonight's show with an article I came across on Mysterious Universe, which seems to be fitting for the holiday. Out in the rolling countryside of the interior of the Istrian Peninsula, in the country of Croatia, is a small sleepy coastal town called Kringa. In modern times, it is known for its quaint beauty and traditional stone houses, a place from another era, stuck in time and steeped in history. Yet, this place was once supposedly besieged by supernatural terror in the night, in an age when vampires were thought to stalk the dark woods, and the undead were very real. Here we can find the history of what is one of the earliest known European accounts of a person being turned into a vampire and holding the entire village in the grip of terror. In the 17th century, the people of this quaint countryside were rather fearful of a dark entity known as the Strigoi, which was said to be a warlock or witch believed to feed off of the blood of humans under the cover of darkness. When one of these Strigoi died, they were believed to arise as an undead revenant to continue their blood-sucking ways, and were also known to ominously knock on the doors of houses to herald the death of a family member. The Strigoi were said to be particularly fond of the blood of widows, and had the unsettling habit of creeping into people's beds at night, especially those of young, beautiful women. Far from mere spooky stories, these were very real creatures for the frightened villagers of the region, and the legend seems to originate from the tiny village of Kringa. It was here where in the early 1600s there lived a man named Grando, born in 1579. Not much is known about Grando's life, and it seems his legacy lies mostly in his death. In 1656, Grando died of a mysterious illness and was purportedly buried in the town's cemetery, but it seems that he wouldn't stay there. People began to tell of a mysterious stranger who would knock on their doors at night, and there were also reports of Grando being sighted skulking about in the gloom, even though he was supposed to be dead. Chillingly, whenever a door was knocked upon by this shadowy figure, someone within the house would fall into sickness and die. One of the most frightening accounts was when Grando repeatedly came at night to his widow's room to torment and torture and even rape her. This insidious phantom would supposedly terrorize this quiet village for a full 16 years, and the village priest, a Father Giorgio, allegedly became convinced that this was a supernatural creature called the Strigoi, and that Grando was somehow still alive, in a sense. Tired of living in fear, the villagers finally gathered the courage to put together a posse to hunt down the Strigoi, sharpening hawthorn sticks into wicked spears for the purpose of killing it. In 1672, they went out into the gloomy wilderness to seek Grando out, going to the cemetery where he was supposedly buried to confront him once and for all. They did not have to look long, as the ghastly visage of Grando blossomed out of the night, his face described as gaunt, pale, and looking as if he were simultaneously smiling and choking. The men almost fled in the face of this potent supernatural evil, but were somehow able to stand their ground to face the tall, dark form of Grando, who was fearlessly striding towards them through the flickering light of the men's torches. According to the historical record of the account, the men lashed out with their spears, only to find that they would not penetrate Grando's flesh, merely bouncing off as if he were made of rock, and this was enough to send them scattering away in terror. The next day, Father Giorgio tried a different tactic, opting to take his courageous group to the cemetery during the day and see if they could stop Grando by digging up his grave under sunlight. When the grave was dug up, they indeed did find his corpse lying there, perfectly preserved with a smile on his face, and Father Giorgio then apparently held up a cross and proclaimed, "Look, Strigoi, there is Jesus Christ, who saved us from hell and died for us. And you, Strigoi, you cannot have peace." They then brought their sharpened sticks down, only to find that they still would not penetrate. Out of desperation, one of the village men, a man named Stephen Milisic, hacked at the creature's neck with a saw, and this seemed to work, decapitating Grando to end his reign of evil. In some versions of the story, the corpse sheds tears, and the grave mysteriously fills with blood after the beheading, and it is all rather dramatic and spectacular. The story of the vampire Grando would go on to become legendary, told in various forms, and much of this would form the basis of various European vampire lore in the coming centuries. It definitely shaped the Croatian lore on Strigoi, and it is widely considered to be among the first historical European accounts of a real person turning into an actual vampire. Another bizarre account supposedly happened in the quaint countryside of England. It is a case that has become a curious bit of lore and a historical oddity that has been talked about to this day. The story of what has come to be known as the Croglan Grange vampire begins in 1875 in the remote and picturesque area of Cumberland in northwest England. According to the tale, one spring, two brothers named Edward and Michael Cranswell and their sister Amelia came to this serene place and temporarily rented out a single-story stone farmhouse called the Croglan Grange, which overlooked the valley and was near an ancient churchyard and was owned by a family called the Fishers. The siblings were so enamored with the quiet rural life of this town that they decided to stay for a while and became well known among the locals. Indeed, they were so at home here that it became more and more apparent that they were going to stay a lot longer than originally planned. The trio stayed in that old stone farmhouse all the way through the winter and to the next summer, which brought with it a stifling heat wave, with temperatures higher than the region had ever seen. According to the story, one very hot and muggy evening, Amelia laid down in her room, but could not sleep, because of the oppressive heat. Instead, sitting there propped up in bed gazing out into the summer night through the open shutters. It was then that she noticed what appeared to be two flickering lights meandering through the dark trees outside to gain brightness as they approached her window, much to the girl's growing alarm. As they did, she apparently became overwhelmed by a sense of pure, thick dread, and as the source of the light bloomed out of the dark behind that pane of glass, she could see that it was a hideous brown face with flaming eyes that leered in at her and began to scratch at the window, which was luckily locked, in what seemed to be an attempt to open it. As the thing's clawed hands scabbled and scratched at the glass, the terrified girl wanted to cry out, but found that her voice would not work, that she was completely paralyzed with fear, transfixed on this thing at the window, and only able to stare silently and tremble as the beastly entity outside began to graduate from scratching on the glass to peeling away the lead that sealed the edges of the window pane. When the window fell to the floor from its moorings, and a skeletal clawed hand reached in to unlock it, Amelia was still unable to scream, her voice imprisoned within her by fear, and she was equally helpless as a hulking dark humanoid shape flowed across the room to take her in its arms, grab her hair, and fiercely yank her head back to expose her throat. Through all of this, she was petrified and unable to move, but when the creature bent down to sink its teeth into her neck, the pain freed her voice, and she unleashed an epic shriek. The scream was loud enough to wake the girl's two brothers, and they rushed into the room, breaking down the locked door to find the strange intruder escaping through the window. One of the brothers then ran after it with a fire poker in hand, but it was described as inhumanly fast, swiftly moving along in a series of gigantic strides, and it finally leapt over one of the walls of the church to disappear into the night. Amelia herself was wounded and bleeding from her neck, but she survived the attack. At the time, she apparently came to the conclusion that she had been the victim of some psychotic madman escaped from an asylum, and the word vampire did not come into the picture at this point. The concerned brothers wanted to get their sister away from that place and allow her some time to recover, so they subsequently took a long vacation to Switzerland. When they returned to Crogland Grange the following autumn, they did so fully prepared for any further trouble they might have with the deranged trespassers. The brothers arranged to sleep in a room directly across from Amelia's and kept pistols ready at all times, with Amelia making sure to securely close her shutters every night. For some time, it seemed as if things had returned to normal, and the winter passed without incident. However, that spring, whatever evil it was that lurked out there in the night, came calling once again. On this evening, Amelia was woken by that same, now familiar sound of a scratching and tapping at her window, which was now properly shuttered to block the view of the horrifying visage of what she knew hovered beyond. Bracing herself for the worst, but hoping it was just some animal, she climbed up to peek out of the very top portion of the pane, not covered by the shutters. There, hunched over at her window, was that creature again, with the same shriveled, hideous countenance, and those same burning embers for eyes. She was able to scream this time, and when she did, her brothers immediately sprang into action, bursting out of the house with pistols, loaded and ready. They allegedly managed to shoot it in the leg as it ran off, but it still managed to get to the nearby graveyard and scurry down into some sort of crypt. The brothers at the time were too frightened about what might lie down in the murky confines of that crypt beyond the meager light they cast down into it, and decided to come back the next day. When they went around recruiting locals to join them in their crusade, they were to find that other residents had experienced similar nightly visitations, such as one local girl who had also suffered bite wounds from the phantom, and there had also been found dead cattle and sheep drained of blood in the area. Realizing they were perhaps dealing with something supernatural in nature, When the boys returned the next day, they brought along as many able-bodied locals as they could, not knowing what to expect when they ventured into the ancient graveyard vault. When they entered the gloomy tomb, they supposedly found all of the graves within defiled, their coffins torn open, remains scattered upon the stone floor, except for one, and when it was opened, it was found to contain the creature that had been spotted at the window, a fresh bullet hole in its leg, but apparently in some sort of trance or sleep. Shocked and now convinced that they were dealing with a vampire, the brothers quickly had the body burned right there where it lay, thus ending the reign of terror of the Croglan Grange vampire. Next on our countdown of creepy encounters comes an experience from a poster on Reddit by the name of Baby Turns Blue. The poster says, I grew up in a densely forested rural area in central Virginia, and like most kids my age, 10 at the time of the story, I spent a lot of time playing in and around the woods. My best friend and I had found a creek one day while exploring different deer trails through the woods. This creek we happened on was a very rare find and the perfect spot for us to play. It was wide and deep enough to swim around in, and had nice, soft mossy banks on either side to rest on after we had tired ourselves out. The water was cool and clear, no copperheads, and no mosquitoes because the water was constantly running. We were psyched. After a few hours of swimming, we had to walk back home for lunch, but made plans to pack lunch the next day so we could have a picnic on the creek banks and spend the whole day there. The next morning we set out for the woods around 1 p.m., planning to have the picnic first and swim after. We entered at the same spot we had the previous day and followed what we thought was the same deer trail. It was not. At the point where we should have found the creek, we walked into a small clearing that was covered in huge, thick ferns. We had definitely never walked past this before, so, being both hungry and tired of walking, we decided to eat in the clearing. We laughed and played around there for a while, spitting watermelon seeds at each other from our lunch. It was an absolute blast, and we were both in wonderful giddy moods. That all changed, however, as soon as we packed up and set back out to find the creek. As we walked on, the woods started to feel darker and colder. We got skittish, and I noticed my friend kept whipping her head around to look behind us. After about a half hour of walking, we came up on what looked like an entire overgrown bathroom. Sink, toilet, and bathtub, all sitting arranged together and covered in ivy. It's pretty common to find weird stuff like this in the middle of the woods, so we just walked on and made jokes to lighten the mood, calling it Bigfoot's bathroom. After another hour of walking and not seeing anything that we recognized, we started to panic. Instead of trying to reach the creek, we were now just trying to find our way back home, or out of the woods at least. I told her that we should follow the sun, and eventually we would come up on a road, or someone's property, where we could find help. She insisted on another way, and we began yelling at each other out of fear and, let's be honest, little girl bossiness. I told her that if she thought she was so right, that she should just go her way and we would see who got out first. So, we split up. Now, as an adult, I fully acknowledge I was being a stubborn brat, and also an idiot. It was the worst possible thing we could have done. Not even 10 minutes later, after splitting up, I began to hear someone walking maybe 100 feet behind me. Thinking it was my friend who had decided to go my way after all, I slowed down so she could catch up to me. Instead, whatever it was matched my pace. I slowed down, and it slowed down. I stopped, and it stopped. This went on for hours. The whole time I was going back and forth on whether or not it was in my head, or there was really something following me. I picked up a big stick and swung it a few times to make sure it was sturdy enough if I had to hit someone with it. As it began to get dark, I came up on something that made my heart sink into my stomach. It was Bigfoot's bathroom. I had just walked in a huge circle for hours, despite being 100% sure I was following the setting sun, west, the entire time. Confused and frustrated, I sat down on a log and screamed my little heart out while smacking my whoop-ass stick repeatedly into the ground. As I tried to collect myself, I heard the footsteps again, walking up on me from behind. I called out my friend's name as loud as I could, but no answer. Then, after a short pause, the steps began to run towards me. I jumped up and booked it as fast as I could, in the opposite direction. Now, this is the truly horrifying part, which I typically omit while telling people this story. As I was sprinting through the darkening woods, I began to hear what I thought were church bells. I looked up to see the darkest, deepest cloud I have ever seen in my life. In the middle, it was so black it was like looking into the night sky, and the dark gray around it seemed to be swirling. It gave me a horrible feeling to look at it, almost like the nausea you get when looking through binoculars for too long. What sickened me further is that I realized the sound of the bells was coming through the hole in the clouds. They were deafeningly loud, I mean really booming out of this thing. When I realized this, I stopped dead in my tracks. I felt a sense of absolute and overwhelming dread that has gone unmatched in all my 24 years on this planet. Something in my head began screaming that if I did not run away from whatever the hell that cloud was, no one was ever going to see me again. I would be gone. I did not want to run toward the thing chasing behind me either, so I made a sharp right turn and took off away from both. It was now completely dark, and I was running blind through the woods, smacking through branches, wheezing and tripping every few feet for what seemed like another hour, until I smacked into something low and flew over it, hitting the ground so hard that all the air in my lungs was knocked out of me. As I lay there trying to recover, I realized that I couldn't hear the bells anymore. Then my eyes adjusted more to the dark, and I realized that what had just made me go ass over teeth was an old fence. Grabbing hold of it, I prayed it would lead me to a farm, and sure enough it did. I walked up over a hill about a mile to the back of the farmhouse, explained what had happened, and the farmer graciously gave me a ride back home. I was covered head to toe in scrapes, oozing blood, and more exhausted than I had ever been in my life, but I was finally safe. It was past 9 p.m. when I finally walked through my front door. My friend had gotten back home shortly after we had split up, and figured that I had as well, so hadn't told anybody I was lost, and my family just figured I was still out after dark, which wasn't uncommon for me. They were shocked when I walked in beat up and crying. Nobody had been looking for me at all. To this day, I wonder how long they would have waited to come find me if I hadn't been lucky enough to find the fence, and if it would have been too late. The next portion of tonight's episode is brought to us by one of our listeners named Rob. Rob calls their experience Stories from a Nursing Home. Rob says, "Hello, Nick. I started listening to your podcast about a month ago and love it. After listening to other stories on here, I decided to share a few of my own. These stories take place in a nursing home I worked at years ago. My first story is called Call Light. When I was 18 years old, I started working overnights at the local nursing home after graduating high school, and I remained working there for 2.5 years. I had taken the overnight shift because I tended to stay up late anyway, playing games or walking around town and the nearby walking trails. My first night working alone, I learned 3 things. Number 1, staying up all night working is a lot different than staying up all night playing video games. Number 2, coffee is your friend. Number 3, this nursing home has a way different vibe at night. The first few hours of the shift went by as normal. I did my rounds, checking on the residents and stocking the supply room with briefs and linen for the day shift. Around 2:30 or 3 a.m., I started getting sleepy and hearing what I thought was whispering and seeing stuff out of the corner of my eye. I of course chalked this up to being tired and my eyes playing tricks on me, but then a call light went off. Still being new to the nursing home, I had not completely memorized which residents were in what rooms yet. We do have a list of what residents we have, but I was in such a hurry I forgot to look at it, though not that it mattered, because when I got to the room, I realized it was unoccupied. This would be a common occurrence throughout my career in the medical field, both in the hospital I worked at and this nursing home. Thinking to myself, well, this is odd, I decided it was a fluke, shut it off and started walking back to the desk, when out of nowhere, I got tinnitus in the ear facing the doorway to that room, and chills started crawling up my back. For me, it's a high-pitched whine, followed by some temporary deafness for a few seconds after the whining passes. I immediately felt like I was being watched, and the whole hallway took on an eerie vibe. I fast walked back to the desk, but as soon as I sat down, a call light went off again. My heart sank. Luckily, or so I thought, it was in a different room. This resident's room was the first one on that same hallway as the unoccupied room. Looking down towards that room, which happened to be at the end of the hall, it seemed darker and overall just wrong. I should explain, there are 3 hallways in the wing I was working on. Each one has a fire exit door with big windows, so you can clearly see the outside streetlights from the road. Even with the outside lights coming through the door's big windows, that hallway seemed to absorb all of it. I could see the lights outside, but the hallway itself seemed covered in shadow. After staring for what felt like too long, I decided to enter my resident's room, trying to put that feeling out of my mind. Now this resident, I will call M, was immobile. She could not walk or sit up, and had to have a very special chair that strapped her in so she wouldn't slide out of it onto the floor. M also had very bad dementia. She could talk, but it was nothing more than rambling nonsense. As I walked in, M said to me, "Can you see him? Can you see him, honey?" And she points to the wall in front of her bed. This catches me off guard, as up until now, she's never said anything coherent to me. I look at the wall and see nothing, but that feeling of being watched slowly starts coming back. Again she says, "Do you see him? Do you see him yet? He's right there." I stare a little longer, almost expecting something at this point to appear, but nothing. I say to M, "No, M, I don't see anyone," to which she replies, "Okay, honey, well, come give me a hug." This did not give me a good feeling for some reason. This was the most lucid I had ever seen this resident. Come give me a hug," she said. Against my better judgment, I decided to give M a hug. Something in her voice sounded just sad and a little scared. So I lean in to give her a half hug, you know, like putting your hands on someone's shoulders just to comfort them. As I lean in a little closer to say to M that it's all right, you're safe, out of nowhere, she violently latches onto me and bites the shoulder of my scrub top, slightly ripping it. I jump back and she starts yelling, Get back here, you big ass!" followed by strange growling sounds and slamming her hands up and down on the bed, like she was possessed. Get out now if you're not going to do anything," she said. Not one to disappoint and feeling thoroughly scared stupid, I did as asked. I got out and went back to the desk. Now, I knew she would have conversations with herself and outbursts from time to time, but the absolute malice in her voice was horrifying. I called down to the charge nurse at the other end of the facility and told her what had happened, but she did not seem to be concerned by it and chalked it up to M being M. At the desk, I could hear her talking to herself, saying, "Oh yeah? Yeah, he's gone. He's a big dumbass anyway. We don't need him. Well, come here then. Get in here." This conversation continued all night long, until about 20 minutes before the morning shift came on. I only went back to that room again to do my rounds, and while she was still talking to herself, it seemed like she didn't even register me at all. The rest of the night seemed pretty uneventful, and that dark, eerie feeling passed as it went on. When the morning shift came on, I related to them what had happened with the call light, and was met with some laughter, and one of the more experienced staff telling me, "Oh, baloney, that didn't happen." But when I told them about M, this same staff member said to me, "M used her call light? She's never used her call light. I don't even think she knows how to anymore." At this point, I was physically and emotionally done with this night, and just wanted to go home. Rob's second story is called Water Me. Rob says, This second story takes place a couple years later. We had a resident who was a centurion, and then some. She was quiet and kept to herself, but was still sharp and able to do almost everything for herself. I will refer to her as S. I didn't have to take care of S very often, but the few times I did, I noticed that her room always seemed to be so quiet compared to all the other rooms. Not eerie or weird, just quiet and calm. Anyway, one night at dinner, I'm helping a different resident eat, when all of a sudden one of the other staff says, "Oh my God, is S okay?" I look over to see S slouched to one side of her wheelchair, not moving. I quickly go over to her, and she does not really respond, other than a low, quiet moan. Now, S has been having some health problems lately, and S was a DNR, or Do Not Resuscitate. Per hers and her family's wishes, she did not go to the hospital, but nevertheless, her family and doctor were notified of her sudden condition. At this point, all we can do is make her as comfortable as possible. We get her back to her room, and after getting her into bed, the other staff member asks me if I need any more help with her, to which I say, "Nah, I'm good from here, thanks." I wash her up and put her in a clean nightgown, then tuck her into bed. The whole time she says nothing, and has a blank stare. I feel awful for her, and at the time, I wished I could do more. As I'm about to leave the room, I say goodnight, S. I turn to leave, and I hear, "Water me." I turn around and I look at S and say, "What was that, S? Water me?" At this point, she raises her hand up like she wants to hold it. I think to myself, she's scared and can no longer communicate it correctly. I grab her hand in an effort to comfort her, but instantly regret it. As soon as I grab her hand, I get a horrible pain in my chest. My head starts spinning, and I feel like passing out. Even worse, I look down at S, and she is making this sucking motion with her mouth, like she was drinking from a straw. I somehow regained enough sense to let go of S and stumble to the opposite side of the room. The pain in my chest subsided immediately, and when I looked at S, she had the same blank expression on her face, but slowly raised her hand into the air and kept it there like she was waiting. I left the room and did not return the rest of the night. I had a few days off, and by the time I returned to work, she had passed away. It still creeps me out to this day. Our next tale of terror comes from another of our listeners by the name of Bella. Bella's story is called Bigfoot at Our House. Bella says, "Hi Nick, I have recently discovered your podcast. I recently heard a listener's story about Bigfoot, and it reminded me quite a bit of an experience I had last summer in rural Georgia. My family and I had recently purchased a summer cabin in the absolute middle of nowhere in Georgia. There were no houses for miles, and no other people anywhere nearby. The house backs up to a national forest, meaning it closes down at night and there is absolutely no hunting allowed. This is important to remember, as it explains how people could not possibly have been responsible for what we experienced. The town and forest we were located in are one of the top Bigfoot sighting locations in the world, which explains a lot. We visit Georgia every summer, but previously had rented cabins from others. We always stay in rural areas and have heard nearly every animal imaginable at night. This experience was nothing like we had seen or heard before. During our first night at the house, my family and I all gathered around a fireplace on our porch. For reference, it was me, 18, my brother, 13, my parents, my grandparents, and the family dog. To be honest, none of us believed in Bigfoot, nor had any of us had an experience until that night. As we all sat around the fire, my brother jokingly said he was going to do Bigfoot calls. After learning our town was a top Bigfoot sighting area, my brother started researching Bigfoot calls purely out of curiosity. At this time, it was a little bit after sunset, so it was dark, but we could still see. He started calling out long whoops, similar to what we had listened to previously in the day. To our complete astonishment, there was a response. It was different than the call my brother did, and incredibly deep, long, and guttural. My dog was petrified and sprinted into the house. This was out of character for her. She is typically on high alert and ready to attack when she hears noises of any sort. My family were all shocked and figured that this response had been an echo. My brother repeated this call numerous times. Each time, the call back was slightly different. We were all having fun with it and told my brother to stop the calls to see if Bigfoot answered back. In our heads, we all thought that the calls would stop, all of us thinking it was an echo, but to our horror, the calls continued, getting louder and louder, as if this thing was coming closer to us. The calls were varied and sounded similar to a large monkey or dog. It is hard to explain. We were freaked out, but not too concerned. That is until we all saw something. At our house, there was a large open field that is fenced in, which is completely surrounded by forest, and a creek at the bottom of the yard. We all heard a large splash in the creek and turned to look down the long yard. I swear every single one of us saw a large creature in the creek. We could see the general figure, but since it was just after sunset, there was little definition. However, I can say that this is larger than a human could possibly be. After seeing this, another call followed, even louder than the ones before. We all bolted into the house, locked the doors, and went into the basement. The calls continued for a few hours, although they were considerably farther away than they were when we could see the figure in our yard. The skeptic in me wants to say that this was fake, either a prank or some large animal, but I can't find a rational explanation. There is no way this was another human. The house is completely secluded, and the figure was far too large. Nobody believes me when I tell this story, but I can promise you every single detail is true. I genuinely believe that we all had a Bigfoot in our backyard. We have not been back to the house since, and I am not looking forward to visiting again. The last story I'd like to share with you tonight was also contributed by one of our listeners. Their name is Lydia, and Lydia's story is called I Wish It Had Been a Movie. Lydia says, "My entire life I have had experiences. So much so, I honestly thought it was a normal part of everyone's daily life until I was well into my teenage years. Therefore, I have many stories, but the one I want to share today is straight from the movie screen. I don't have a better way to explain it, and most people who hear it assume that it's fake because it seems like it's straight from Hollywood. This story starts when I was around 13 or 14. I lived, and my mom still does, in an old home out in a small town in Midwestern America, built in the 1800s. It's directly across the street from an equally old cemetery that no one visits anymore. I had mentioned to some friends my experiences of seeing some long, lanky, solid black humanoid creatures walking around the outside of the property, and general haunting things happening inside my house. With this information, my friends thought it would be fun to bring a Ouija board over and see who or what we could communicate with. Having no context of the consequences at the time of a Ouija board, I let it happen. At first, everything was pretty basic. All the usual, what's your name, are you a good or bad spirit, blah blah blah. This became a staple of our friends' group to play the Ouija board for about a year, and nothing too crazy happened, other than the occasional light flickering, or the board saying something specific about us. Over this year of playing with the board, I began to notice that the black humanoid creatures around the property grew in numbers and were slowly getting closer to the house, but never close enough for me to be concerned. Nor did I make the connection that their increase in presence was related to the Ouija board. That is until the last time we used it. The last time was just a normal night. My friends and I had gone to the local movie theater to see Paranormal Activity 2, and then go back to my house for Ouija board fun and a bonfire. Once we started playing with the Ouija board, it was not being responsive, so one of my friends thought that provoking it would be a good move to get their attention. He pushed to the point, and he stated, "If you're really a scary ghost, you'll open up all the kitchen cabinets, like the demon in Paranormal Activity." We waited in suspense, and nothing happened. So we said goodbye, and went outside to start the bonfire. We all made a point of saying how dark it was outside, because it was not a normal dark. It was darker than dark, if that makes sense. But we started the bonfire and moved on. The back of my house has 3 windows, 1 in the kitchen and 2 in the bedroom. This is an important detail. As we're enjoying the fire, we noticed the kitchen light turned on. I announced my mom was probably home, and that was that. The light eventually turned off, so I assumed she had gone upstairs to her room, which faces the front of the house, so we would not see the lights on if she had. Not too long after, my friend needed to go to the bathroom, and headed towards the back door, which opens directly to the kitchen. He opens the door and stands there a moment, closes the door, and walks back to the fire without ever going inside. I asked him why he didn't go to the bathroom, and with a straight face, he told me that every drawer and cabinet in my kitchen was open. We all ran inside to see. Sure enough, everything was open. I immediately assume that my mom is playing a joke, and we go hunting for her in the house, only to find her nowhere in sight. I call her, and she tells me that she is staying at my grandparents' for the evening and hasn't been home since that morning. I close all the cabinets, stop the fire, and send all but one of my friends home. She and I go to bed, and both have terrible nightmares of those humanoid creatures pacing in front of my bedroom door, as if waiting for something, and eventually finding their way down to the basement to hide in the shadows. She tells me about her dream in the morning, and I tell her that I had the same dream, and we try to get past it by cleaning up from the night before. While cleaning, I notice that the Ouija board box is out, and it's empty. I realize that we never put it up, so I go to clean it up, only it's nowhere to be found. I ask my friend if she's seen it, and she says no. We call the others who were there that night before to see if they cleaned it up or took it, but none of them had. In the weeks that follow, I would see the creatures in my house, specifically in closets or in rooms where the lights were off. It was as if they could not enter lit rooms. Things began to go missing. It started with books and remotes, but eventually got to tools and heavy vases. Then one day I came home from school, and in the dead center of the room was the Ouija board. I immediately asked my mom if she had put it there, as only she and I lived in the house. I showed her, and she said no. At this point, I came clean on everything that had been happening, and asked for her help in stopping it. She picked up the board and threw it away. The next morning, I watched the garbage truck take it away. That night, I woke up in a still state, unable to move, but conscious. This was not paralysis, and I know it wasn't with every fiber of my being. Trying to get a grip on what is happening, my first instinct is to immediately start screaming, "Get out of this room!" on repeat with loud intensity. I hear the loud basement door creak open, and the voice is so panicked and desperate for me to get out. I am able to roll over and essentially crawl to my mom's room. As soon as I am out of the doorway of my room, everything comes to, and I am actually awake, crying in the hallway outside my room, and I hear footsteps walking towards the stairs. I bolt full speed into my mom's room and lock the door and jump into her bed, shaking, explaining what is happening. She holds me until I fall asleep. Years later, she relayed to me that she heard the steps come all the way up the stairs and stop outside the room, and then heard a loud voice say my name, laugh, and then walk away. The next morning she let me sleep while she investigated and found the Ouija board, once again, in my room. She boxed it up and locked it away in a secret place to never be seen again. The house has since been cleansed, and the creatures are still outside, but no longer inside. I do my best, now that I'm an adult, to never spend the night there, because I just know in my gut that something will happen again. I hope you all enjoyed tonight's stories, and if you're still in need for some creepy content to fill the rest of your Halloween, here are some of my favorite podcast recommendations, in no particular order. Into the Fray Radio, with host Shannon LeGros. Expanded Perspectives, with hosts Kyle Filson and Cam Hale. Sasquatch Chronicles, with host Wes Germer. Monsters Among Us, with host Derek Hayes. And The Confessionals, with host Tony Merkel. These podcasts cover a wide range of high strangeness, and I hope that you enjoy them as much as I do. Now, this is just a short list of some of my favorites, but I'll be sure to share more with you in the future. Before I leave you for the evening, I'd also like to say thank you to everyone for tuning in and supporting the podcast, and a special thank you goes out to Rob, Bella, and Lydia for writing in and sharing their experiences with all of us. If you've witnessed something unexplainable and you'd like to have your story shared on the podcast, please contact me at paranormalmysteriespodcast@gmail.com or visit paranormalmysteriespodcast.com and click on the Tell Your Story link. All of our contact information, as well as links to my favorite podcasts, can be found in the show notes. And remember, if you'd like to support the podcast, you can visit us over on patreon.com/paranormal mysteries, or visit us on buymeacoffee.com/paranormal to make a simple one-time donation. And of course, subscribing to the podcast and sharing it with your friends is always one of the best ways to show your support, and we appreciate it. Until next time, I hope you all have a wonderful and safe Halloween, and we'll see you back here on Wednesday with our next episode. From all of us at the Paranormal Mysteries Podcast, thank you so much for listening, and have a happy Halloween.